And I'm not taking down that tweet or acknowledging that my tweet violated the Twitter rules.
Up yours, woke moralist! We'll see who cancels!
Hello everyone, once again, from the Tory capitalist dystopia of the United Kingdom, and sadly, Jordan Peterson has found me. He's found me on Twitter, he's responded to one of my tweets, and of course, what happens when Jordan Peterson does this? All my mentions are flooded by fascists saying the most unhinged stuff to me. And of course, it's also very fitting that the tweet he was responding to was me saying that anyone who thinks communism is worse than fascism is a fascist, which is just a fact at this point. I've made a couple videos on this and about how anti-communism as a political ideology is a fascist ideology. I'm not talking about someone not being a communist, that being the key difference. I'm talking about anti-communism, which is tied up with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, historical misinformation like the Black Book of Communism, and also relies on unhinged conspiracy theories like, cultural Marxism, in the past Judeo-Bolshevism, and also a lot of racism is inherent in anti-communism, either the modern day kind with anti-Chinese racism, or historically racism against Russian Slavs, racism against black communists in the United States, racism against Asian and African communists during the Cold War. You can't really divorce anti-communism as a political ideology from these things, and to actually believe that communism is worse than fascism, you pretty much have to be more sympathetic to fascism itself, and likely probably believe in a lot of fascist things if you think that, because I don't even care what you think of communism. If you don't like communism, if you see Stalin's Russia or Pol Pot's Cambodia and you think, like, I don't know, communism led to that or something, I think even you can see that because there's other examples, let's say Vietnam, China, Cuba, that communism as an ideology is not as bad as fascism and hasn't been as destructive to the human race as fascism. Again, even if you don't agree with it, even if you don't like it. It's hard to have a nuanced conversation when you grow up brainwashed to be automatically an anti-communist if you grow up in pretty much any country on earth that isn't like the few communist countries remaining. And one more thing to say is I'm calling them communist countries. You don't need to put down in the comments, oh my god, they are not communist, stop calling them that. There's never been a communist country. Communism has never existed, right? What there has been is countries led by communist parties. People call these countries communist. So for today's video, we are calling them communist countries because they are led by communist parties, not because they've all achieved some sort of classless, moneyless, utopian society, right? Because that's just never happened. So all of that coming up for you today. Please like the video. In the comments, let me know your thoughts on all of this. Also follow me on social media at the Kavernacle, on Twitter, on Blue Sky, on Threads, and on Instagram, and also check out the Patreon. Benefits include access to the Discord server, my Nintendo Switch friend code, and old exclusive content, and also message me if you want access to the Discord server and I'll send you your code. And also check out my subreddit and check out my second channel. The links to everything down in the description. So Jordan Peterson wasn't just like quote tweeting a tweet of mine that I wrote on my timeline. He was actually doing this because I'm pretty sure this guy sent him onto my trail. So Konstantin Kizin made a little video on Twitter and he writes, communism is the most dangerous and destructive ideology that has ever been inflicted on the human race at scale. Yes, worse even than fascism. And if you guys didn't know, this guy is one of the hosts of Trigonometry podcast, which basically just platforms far-right people, pretty much. It's all about anti-wokeness, meaning most of their guests are actually on the far right. Not the far right as we understand it today, not like Nick Fuentes, but like the Matt Walsh types, the American far right who don't think they're far right, but everyone else knows they are, right? So this is the guy who's saying communism is worse than fascism, while he platforms people who literally describe themselves as fascist, and people like Matt Walsh. I've never heard him say something that isn't compatible with fascism, right? And that's just pretty common. Most people who say communism is worse subscribe to some sort of like ultra conservative or far right ideology. I'll just play you a few bits of this video. It's nothing you haven't heard before about, how communism is worse and how they're not actually defending fascism, but they kind of are by saying communism is worse. So let's have a quick look.
Why communism is even worse than fascism. I'm aware that if you follow our channel, you understand nuance and complexity, but sadly not everyone does. In view of this, I have to make this disclaimer for those who will inevitably attempt to misrepresent what I'm saying in the future. Nothing I'm about to say is intended to serve as a defense of fascism. Arguing about whether fascism is better than communism is like fighting over your preferred flavor of gangrene. I merely ask that those of you who abhor fascism as much as I do are also willing to be intellectually honest and recognize the fact that communism is in fact even worse. Why? Because while fascism is nationalistic, totalitarian, and collectivist, it does not aspire to dominate the lives of ordinary citizens to anything like the same extent. Communism, remember, rejected the idea of private property, private enterprise, or indeed a private life of any kind. In the Soviet Union, you were explicitly told to put the interests of the state above not only your own, but those of your loved ones. Fascism was almost as evil as communism, to be sure, but it did not attempt to achieve its aims by stealing and redistributing private property, seizing your business, or installing a new tyrannical hierarchy under the pretense of eradicating it. Drive to better your own life, to see your children prosper and thrive, to create and build things worthy of notice and admiration. All of these were beaten, starved, and tortured out of the people who had the misfortune to live under communist regimes. So yes, communist societies did kill more people than the fascist, but they also engaged in a totalitarianism of the mind, of the kind that not even Hitler aspired to. It is for this reason, above all others, that those of us who lived under communism, or come from families that did, reject so strongly the modern trend in which ideology is elevated above truth, political correctness is prioritized over facts, and the powers that be increasingly seek to control not only what we do, but also what we think.
If you have to put a disclaimer at the start saying you aren't defending fascism by saying communism is worse, I think even deep down you already know most people who do this, even if you think you're not doing this, are actually people trying to make fascism seem better, right? Because anti-communism is inherent in fascism. Everyone who's a fascist is an anti-communist, and they all believe these conspiracy theories about communists trying to destroy Western civilization. Like Joseph Goebbels used to say it in speeches, those Judeo-Bolsheviks are trying to destroy Western civilization, undermine it. Obviously, these conspiracies all go back to the Jews as well. So whether this guy thinks it or not, saying communism is worse than fascism is just insane, right? It's like, take Cuba today, a communist-run country. Take Vietnam today, a communist-run country. Even China, communist-run country, right? And saying they are worse than Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, Franco's Spain, a whole host of other like fascist countries, right? They're actually arguing with me that these are all worse. Communism is worse than fascism. Of course, they like to hone in on like Stalin's Russia in the 1930s or Pol Pot's Cambodia in the 1970s. I don't feel the need to defend Stalin's Russia. There's been a long history of communists not liking Stalin, right? It's nothing new. Stalinism is its own like offshoot of, you know, communist rule of these countries, which a lot of us don't like. And then Pol Pot's Cambodia, like, literally isn't communism by any definition. Any sane, rational person is going to tell you that. And also, don't look up who overthrew Pol Pot and then was punished by sanctions by the United States and the UN. And also don't look up who funded Pol Pot's insurgency against the Vietnamese-backed government in Cambodia. But if you're making the argument that communism as a whole is worse than fascism, you just lose all credibility to say that 1930s Germany is the same as 2023 Cuba. Because that's essentially what you're saying to us, right? You're saying countries that have dedicated their lives to anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, and making people's lives better, even if they're flawed, like Cuba, for example, they're actually worse than all these fascist countries from the 30s, 40s, and, you know, later on. And anyone who doesn't like communism, who isn't an anti-communist ideologically, they will tell you that's absolute BS. Now, of course, I quote tweeted this saying, the only people who think communism is worse than fascism are fascists. And then he quote tweets it saying, and people who experience communism, and people who are historically literate, and anyone with a functioning brain. Apart from that, you're spot on, right? So apparently it's super rational to think that 2023 Cuba is actually worse than 1930s and 40s Germany. Anyone with a brain, anyone who's read history. And just for reference later, I put in my bio, I have a history degree and a master's in international relations because, yeah, first thing I do. But I do that because when I talk about these issues, I always get loads of people telling me to open a history book or learn about politics. So I put that in there just to immediately like kind of shut that down. But don't worry, people are still going to tell me that. But then Petey Boy also found this tweet, I think probably from what the guy said first, because Petey absolutely loves anti-communism. He writes me a nice poem saying, "You are stupid or corrupt, or stupid and corrupt." It's so wild to see Petey Boy, who is having like an absolute meltdown over the last couple of years, finally interact with me. And it's through this absolutely like bizarre poem, because I've been covering him quite a lot over the last like 3 weeks and covering his mental decline and how insane he is on social media. And just to see him do this to me as well is just so funny. And then I just tweet back to bed, Grandpa, that's enough crazy tweeting for today. But in his own comments, he has like a lot of people like agreeing with him or disagreeing with him slightly by both sides in it, saying, "I will not choose between the two lesser of evils. Communism and fascism are not the only form of government to exist." Under old Konstantin's tweets, other people were saying stuff like, "This guy is a history grad, oh my. Anyone who's read the Gulag Archipelago," we might talk about this later if we have time. Someone saying, "Little thought experiment, people in Portugal and Cambodia in 1974 are free to migrate to the other, including when in camps and in prisons, they stand trial again for the same actions." So he's taken fascist Portugal and talk about Pol Pot's Cambodia. But if we want to do this experiment, let's do fascist Portugal, or living in Moscow in the Soviet Union, or living in Havana in Cuba, or living in North Vietnam, right? Like, I'm pretty sure a lot of people would take those over fascist Portugal. Someone else saying his bio reads history grad, an example of how history of communism isn't appropriately covered in education. And this is something you'll see a lot. Apparently, no one who's actually had an education in history and politics, including covering like communism and stuff, apparently they couldn't know any better. And it's people who don't study these things that do know. People who read like the Black Book of Communism and think it's like legit. They're the people you should trust on communism. But anyway, back to my own tweet, because of course, on Elon Musk's Twitter, everyone with a verified check is basically on the far right anyway. So they come into my mention, start saying loads of stuff to me, and it all, you know, pops up. So you have stuff like this. Fact check, false. Communism is objectively worse than fascism. I'm not a fascist or a communist, but fascism was definitely better. But again, then you're a fascist. I'm sorry. If you think that, you're a fascist. People saying, go live in Korea or Venezuela. You can enjoy the system and then talk about it. And I said, I lived in Vietnam 3 months. Does that count? They say, no way, man. That's holidays. Go live there, as they are. So again, right, they always cherry pick to try and take the worst example. So they're telling me, go live in North Korea or Venezuela. North Korea for being like more cut off from the world and authoritarian. Venezuela for being poorer than a lot of countries. But if I say, well, I'll go live in Vietnam or China, like wealthier communist countries, I'll go live in Cuba, which has better like social safety nets. They're like, oh no, not them. You can't choose them. Why? If we're using their logic that Communist Party rule means a communist country, then why you give me the worst examples? Why don't I go live in Vietnam, which has better conditions than a lot of Asian countries? Why don't I go live in Cuba, which has better life expectancy and healthcare than America? Why don't I go live in China, which is one of the most economically powerful countries in the world, which under Communist Party rule has increasing standards of living? Why don't I go live there? No, you must go live in Venezuela or North Korea if you are a real communist. As someone who's a communist, I don't see all these countries as like perfect and oh my God, I want to live there. And I don't see any of its flaws, but I just deal in reality of nearly every country that has switched over from being like a far-right dictatorship to a communist-run country has improved by every metric that matters. That's not to say these countries don't have flaws. You know, I'm a YouTuber. I love my relative free speech in the UK. I couldn't give that up. I don't want to go live in somewhere like China full-time and not really be allowed to criticize the government. But that also goes for capitalist countries like Thailand and Cambodia too. You're not allowed to say anything about the government there. But at the same time, the communist parties in Vietnam, China and Cuba, and in the past the USSR, made those countries better than what they were and are preferable to the far-right dictatorships they used to be, either in Vietnam, either in Russia or in Cuba, right? You don't have to like communist rule. You don't have to like communist parties. You can criticize them all day. I don't mind that. But what I often find refreshing about historians is they deal in facts and reality. So good historians, no matter what their politics, won't just accept stuff as fact because it fits in with their ideology, something Petey boy should learn as he increasingly goes into history and politics. For example, the Black Book of Communism, two of the people who wrote that book said it wasn't credible because the main author kept making up numbers about it and kept adding like German death tolls from World War II into the overall victims of communism, right? Because they were historians with integrity. Even though they didn't like communism, they weren't just going to make stuff up, right? And from that perspective, even though I am a communist as well, I don't agree with loads of stuff the Chinese government does, or even like, you know, the Cuban and Vietnamese government, but I'm still, you know, someone who can recognize economic reality and things communist parties do well, which include growing economies, which include giving people jobs, which include making healthcare better, which include just improving people's lives generally. It would be nice if some of those countries that are behind more on like the social liberties would catch up, but even countries like Cuba recently enshrined into their constitution something really progressive with their new views on LGBT rights and what constitutes an actual family in Cuba as well. And that is actually better than America, right? So it's not so clear cut that, oh my God, communism, no free speech, capitalism, awesome, freedom. Someone else saying, have a read of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, based on Solzhenitsyn's own 8 years in Soviet prison camps. And a lot of people were applying this to me, you know, saying, oh my God, you have to read this book. It's absolute proof that communism is worse than fascism. And like I said, good historians put their political biases aside. And as someone who has read a lot of the historiography around this, loads of credible historians say this work has two things going for it. It's not reliable because it's mainly based on personal testimony and interviews with some survivors, but this guy didn't have access to the actual historical records, which came out later. So in that way, it's inaccurate and has its own personal biases. And also it's become anti-communist propaganda and seen as pro-Western propaganda, even though the author didn't like Western individualism either. Someone like Jordan Peterson takes this as evidence that this is what the book was basically saying and proving. And also the guy was like, you know, a massive anti-Semite as well. So we're going to talk about that a bit later, hopefully. So obviously a lot of you guys aren't exposed to the brain rot of anti-communism where they, you know, see everything fascists did since the 1930s and say, nah, actually the USSR worse. You know, the country that liberated all the camps, the country that sacrificed like tens of millions of its own citizens to fight this, you know, extreme evil in Europe, did most of the heavy lifting in the war. But yeah, these people all think, you know, you're crazy if you think any form of communist country is better than all these terrible fascist ones. You're not good at history. Go read the Gulag Archipelago. Go read the Black Book of Communism and understand history better. You who have a history degree and a master's in international relations, which, you know, is very similar to history as well. But yeah, it's basically your brain on anti-communism. And like I said, I don't care what you think of communism. If you're just a rational human being, even if you don't like communism, there's no way you are making these arguments and trying to argue with me 2023 China, Vietnam, and Cuba, or like 1970s Soviet Union, is actually worse than fascist Germany and Italy, for example. Now, just to go back to the Gulag Archipelago quick, because we have a good article about Jordan Peterson writing a foreword on like a new copy of the book. And someone who's a historian on gulags actually wrote this big article about it, which is very interesting because they're not praising like the gulag system. They're not saying it was great. They're saying it's, you know, terrible and it's an indictment on Stalin's Russia, but they're still very confused why Jordan Peterson is taking this up. But just talking about like the historian response to the Gulag Archipelago anyway. So just on Wikipedia, has a good article showing like the praise and people criticizing it. So UCLA historian J. Arch Getty wrote of Solzhenitsyn's methodology that such documentation is unacceptable in other fields of history and that the work of limited value to the serious student of the 1930s, for it provides no important new information or original analytical framework. Gabor Rittenspawn shared Getty's criticism, saying that he's inclined to give priority to vague reminiscences and hearsay and inevitably leads towards selective bias, adding that one might dwell at length on the inaccuracies discernible in Solzhenitsyn's work. Vadim Rogovin writes of the eyewitness accounts that Solzhenitsyn had read, saying he took plenty of license in outlining their contents and interpreting them. So you have like lots of criticism of the book itself. Even Solzhenitsyn's like ex-wife was saying like loads of it was made up. Obviously for that criticism, we don't know how seriously to take it because, you know, we don't know what happened in that relationship. But I found a good article by a guy called Wilson T. Bell, who's Associate Professor of History and Politics at Thompson Rivers University. And he actually is like an expert on like Soviet gulags and stuff. And to tie this whole video back together, anti-communism, Jordan Peterson calling me out, I thought this was a good one to end it. So why is Jordan Peterson writing about the Gulag? Why did Vintage Classics make the baffling decision to ask controversial psychologist Jordan Peterson to write the foreword to a reprint of the 1970s classic The Gulag Archipelago? So last year, Vintage Classics republished an abridged version of The Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn. The monumental book about the communist Soviet forced labor camp system has been republished and reprinted multiple times. As a scholar of the Gulag, I often use this book, which is frequently assigned in classrooms. So again, this guy isn't someone who totally discounts it, and goes on to say, but why did Vintage Classics ask Peterson, who's a professor of psychology based at the University of Toronto, to write the intro, and why did he actually write it? Peterson has no training in the study of the Gulag or in Russian history. He briefly mentions the Gulag in his first book, but his research and notoriety certainly lie elsewhere. The choice of Peterson to write an introduction to a book on the history of Soviet prisons seems on the part of Vintage Classics a tacit endorsement of Peterson's controversial statements on gender, postmodernism and free speech. In his foreword, Peterson cites no scholarship on the Gulag except for the highly controversial 1997 Black Book of Communism. The 1997 book was published at the early stages of the archival research into communist repression by a group of European researchers. Among the scholars of the USSR, it is seen more of a polemic than an academic work. Stanford historian Amir Weiner described the book in the Journal of Contemporary History as seriously flawed, incoherent, and often prone to mere provocation. But there have been a dozen of academic and popular books on the Gulag published since then, many of which have complicated Solzhenitsyn's picture. In his introduction, Peterson makes no attempt to reflect on the significant impact of Solzhenitsyn's work on the academic study of the Gulag. Solzhenitsyn did not have archival access for his own research and relied on his own experiences and the accounts of other prisoners. Once the archives started opening in the late 80s, researchers were able to examine former classified materials on the Gulag. My research, and that of historian Alan Barenberg, based at Texas Tech, has challenged Solzhenitsyn's characterization of the Gulag as an archipelago of camps largely isolated from Soviet society. We have described shifting and porous camp borders in many areas. These camps incarcerated large numbers of prisoners who interacted regularly with non-prisoners, both inside the camps and outside the camps, sometimes even without guards. Other research has suggested that some attempts at re-education in the Gulag may have been more important and effective than Solzhenitsyn contends, yet much of Solzhenitsyn's picture has been confirmed by archival analysis. While the extent of the destruction of lives and bodies through forced labour continues to be debated, there is no doubt that it took place on a large scale and was an integral component of the Gulag system. But readers will not get an assessment of the current scholarship about either Solzhenitsyn or the Gulag in Peterson's introduction. Instead, readers will read from Peterson a diatribe against communism and in favour of Western individualism. Peterson eschews any pretense of critical thinking on behalf of the reader. He lets readers know that the only logical conclusion and intelligent response to reading Solzhenitsyn is a rejection of communism and group identity. Peterson writes that the Gulag demonstrates the doctrine of group identity inevitably ends with everyone identified as a class enemy, an oppressor, thus guaranteeing repression. Peterson views the Gulag Archipelago as providing clear evidence against communism and group identity and in favour of Western individualism, but Solzhenitsyn did not draw this conclusion. He strongly rejected communism, but he also, based on his experience living in the US, rejected Western individualism. Peterson's understanding of the Gulag seems both limited and dated, and his YouTube video speaking about the Gulag Archipelago is riddled with factual errors. These facts make Peterson an odd choice from an academic voice on the subject. Maybe Peterson helps to sell books and the Gulag Archipelago reach a wider audience, but is Peterson's voice really one that needs further amplification? So that article just like sums everything up perfectly. It gets into what I was saying about being like a good historian, right? This guy is an expert on the Gulag, so he recognizes that Solzhenitsyn's like book has some sort of like legitimacy from his own personal experience and some interviews with survivors, but also it was written in the 1970s and is too much based on one guy's personal experience, right? And doesn't have broader data, so it's not actually historically that relevant, right? But Peterson takes it as gospel, lies about it, mischaracterizes it to play into a worldview of anti-communism to fit his own agenda, because he's an anti-communist who relies on misrepresentation and he's not actually interested in the facts. Because if you're a good historian, like this person is, you have to recognize the nuances. Like he was talking about how people in the camps often interacted with people outside the camp. Even in something that is pretty brutal like the Gulag system, it's not comparable to what the Germans did in the 30s and 40s, right? But Peterson would have you believe that they're not only the same, the Russian one is worse. And again, it doesn't matter what you think about any of this, it's history and it's facts. What one is worse? Nearly everyone who hasn't had their brain rotted by anti-communism, including historians on the Gulag, will tell you the German system was by far worse, because fascism is worse than communism. Even some of the most brutal periods of communist rule in certain countries, like Stalin's Russia, are of course not as bad as fascist Germany. And if you're going to take that example and paint all communist rule as that, you're just being intellectually dishonest, and you're playing into fascist narratives, or you believe fascist narratives and fascist conspiracy theories about communism as a whole, and communism actually being worse than fascism. And of course, for a lot of capitalists, they're always going to prefer fascism, aren't they? Because it protects capital and it promotes capitalism, where a lot of communist rule is about cracking down on capitalism, or in more modern times, having more control over the capitalist system in their countries while they manage a capitalist economy in a globalized like capitalist system that we all have to live in today. So yeah, very, very weird being called out by Petey boy himself. Very weird. He wrote me a lovely little poem, but I think this little like episode just exposes so much and just plays into like lots of my own videos. And if you want some like further analysis of this, I made a whole video, I think it was over a year ago now, when I was talking about like American anti-communism and like Ron DeSantis. So go check that out to read more about the Black Book of Communism and how that is like very, very exaggerated. Not a great piece of academic work at all, but of course something that Peterson cites in his foreword to the Gulag Archipelago. Like, absolutely amazing that this guy is an academic in any sense, but he seems to not realize that being an academic of psychology does not make you a historian or a political scientist. But anyway, let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.